Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for OW2 for having me here. I'm here to talk to you about MySQL in the cloud, though my day job as a geek is to focus on working on MariaDB. We're very close to MySQL, so naturally I'm also going to talk to you about it. Because we have very little time, I'm going to focus not on myself. You can Google me, but I've got 13 years of MySQL experience developing and hacking on MySQL. Now, what is MySQL in the cloud? I can see some of you, so the ones that are here, any of you use database as a service at the moment, or provide a database as a service? Anybody, show of hands? No? Okay. So the old way of doing things is you would actually have to go out, put in a purchase order, get yourself a machine, put it to the data center, install the OS. All this can take several weeks to months before you actually got started with a database server. The new way is much, much simpler. It's like software as a service, but focused on databases, largely led by Amazon RDS. But more and more, you're starting to see people not want to only host in places like Amazon RDS, but in also locations like in Europe or locations like in Brazil and so forth. So MySQL as a service is basically your MySQL available on demand without any installation or configuration on your part, without you having to go and shell out money on software. It is usage-based pricing, and you will not have to maintain or upgrade MySQL. And this is actually quite crucial because DBAs, qualified DBAs for MySQL or Oracle or any database, tends to be really expensive. In Europe alone, a qualified MySQL DBA can pull in 150,000 to 200,000 euros per annum. So if you think that you want to earn more money, go become a professional MySQL DBA. The new method is much simpler. You just get a credit card, and then you enter it into one of the many services, and they will offer you MySQL as a service. Alternatively, if you are playing around with things like OpenStack, you can just do something like Nova boot, and magically you also have services. This is similar when you launch on CloudStack or any other open source infrastructure as a service. So why database as a service? Quite simply, many people today want to handle certain traffic spikes, and then they need more resources. Or you don't have a lot of DBAs available. In fact, you don't have a lot of Linux administrators available. You also can go and use the cloud. And really, it's for rapid deployment and scale out. They say that nowadays, not many venture capital companies will put money into or invest money into a company unless they're using the cloud. If they're not using the cloud and they're actually going to requisition to buy hardware and pay for licenses, nobody wants to deal with them. Today, you've got 4 major choices. Amazon RDS is by far the most popular. Rackspace offers cloud databases, and they have location here in Europe. Google Cloud SQL also has locations here, plus they offer it through a different method. And HP Cloud Relational Database is about the newest available based on OpenStack. There are also more clouds out there. Jelastic is based in Europe, and they're a platform as a service offering both MySQL or MariaDB. So if you want to use a better MySQL for your database, for any of your PHP or Java applications, you can use the Jelastic platform as a service relatively easily. There's also little tinier companies like ClearDB and Joyent. But I'd like to bring your attention to something like Zeround, which gave all their customers earlier this May 2 weeks notice that they were shutting down and you had to move your databases. So if you are going to use MySQL in the cloud or any cloud services, make sure you're going for a big name, someone that's backed and is going to be around for a long time, which is why my focuses are on the other 4 that I talked about earlier. When you're dealing with clouds, remember that there's a difference between regions and availability zones. Every data center location is generally referred to as a region, and you can have multiple availability zones in one region. And within the availability zones, you have very low network traffic between each of them. So if you use a service like Amazon, who's been relatively long established, if you pick their oldest region, you can find up to 5 availability zones. but typically most have 2 to 3 availability zones in them. And this architecture of having regions and availability zones is exactly how people like the OpenStack folk and Google Cloud SQL kind of design, because they generally mimic what Amazon does as leaders in this space. Now, I think location matters more and more, not only in terms of access and lower access patterns and lower access times, but more and more now because you have the cases of people spying on your infrastructure. I think this is possibly a very big issue, especially in the European Union, so you may want to start keeping things locally that are protected by EU data laws and not American data laws. So your choices, obviously, things like Amazon, they offer a separate thing called GovCloud, which is only for American government users. So there's clear potential here for someone to offer this in Europe as well. Rackspace has also got a location here in London, so they're also protected by EU data laws. But the important thing for that one, which is why I put an asterisk, is that Rackspace doesn't allow you to create an EU account if you have a US account. So you have to create a separate account because they're separate entities. Very unlike Amazon, which just works. With Google Cloud SQL, which is probably the newest and probably many of you have never heard of or never even used before, you have also got data centers in the EU. And then you've got HP Cloud, which is the newest kid on the block. They're still in beta, actually. They don't have any European zones yet. They're still mostly US focused. When you choose the cloud, you have to always remember that there's something called a service level agreement. Now, what does a service level agreement translate to? 99.95% uptime a month is about 40 minutes of downtime every month. Can your application and your database handle 40 minutes of downtime every month? I'm not so sure. Unless you have more than one availability zone and you are replicating tremendously, which is the ease of the cloud, is to replicate tremendously. Now, most SLAs that come with that you have to read the fine print of will also tell you that even though they claim 99.95% uptime, they also do not include the mandatory maintenance window that comes every week. So in total, you're having something like 150 minutes of downtime every month. Can you afford 150 minutes of potential downtime without replication? No. You kind of need to have replication through multiple availability zones, or even just use different regions even. And your application needs to handle that. The other thing that I think is pretty crucial is support. How easy is it to get someone on the phone? When something's going wrong, you really want to get someone on the phone. When things are going fine, nobody thinks about support. The easiest people to get in terms of support so far, I've noticed, have to be Rackspace. They claim to have fanatical support, and they really do. HP Cloud is pretty good. If you want to use AWS and you want to get paid support, it starts at about $100 for a phone number, which is not too bad. Google's probably the most expensive in this space. Now, I mentioned that DBAs are very expensive. So you have to also think about who manages it, even though most of it is managed by software exposed via an API. Most of them offer only self-management. That means you will manage it through the point-and-click interfaces that they provide or through connecting to MySQL. But Rackspace offers managed services, which means that you can pay them and they will maintain your databases for you. So if you think that you do not want to hire, this may be a good option for you as well. But I think the key important difference for me as a MySQL developer who's been developing on MySQL since 3.23 in 2000 is what versions of MySQL you can get. Because every couple of years, we actually make a major release, and then we put in a lot of new features. And with MariaDB, we make a new release once every 6 to 9 months, and then you typically see all this folded back into MySQL, something along the lines of every 2 years once. AWS offers the widest range from MySQL 5.1 to 5.5, as well as 5.6. Rackspace offers a woefully outdated database, so I cannot in my right mind tell you, go and use their services today until they upgrade. But the bright side is they may upgrade to MariaDB, so then I can wholly recommend you to use them. Google is currently shipping MySQL Community 5.5, and they're also likely upgrading to MariaDB since they've made a public commitment to move to MariaDB 10. So watch that space for the future. And HP Cloud runs Percona Server, which is a MySQL branch as well. Access methods are pretty important. Today, when you install MySQL, you type MySQL-H to a host, and then you log in via username and password. AWS, HP Cloud, and Rackspace have offered that for quite some time. HP Cloud also allows you to use something called Trove, which is part of the OpenStack project. And Google, only recently, where recently is literally last week, allows you to now log in via the MySQL client. So that is actually new. This is the one thing about cloud services, is that you have to follow very closely the roadmap and follow all these newsletters, because every other day they announce yet another new service. So previously, Google had the worst interface via this tool called GCUtil, but now they match the interface through every other service as well. Configuring MySQL is important. AWS doesn't expose all the available MySQL options for you to play with. This means that if you already have MySQL DBAs, using a database as a service may not be the right solution for you, because they will not be able to configure things the way they like. Cost is obviously important when you choose a service like this. There are obviously network access costs that you must not forget, but generally the good news for you is that cost is always dropping, it's not increasing. And it drops very rapidly, so if you can measure your costs daily, in fact, measure them even hourly, you may find that you can change to a larger instance and save money. Sometimes one large instance will replace 3 instances, and this actually happened in September. Amazon announced a new large instance, which would mean you did not have to have 3 instances. So cost is obviously important, factor that in. And if you want really good cost metric templates, check out Netflix, the company that is fully backed by the Amazon cloud. External replication makes an important difference as well, because you may want to send your data outside of the hosted service or bring your data inside the hosted service. And there's a tool, a little bit of glue called Tungsten Replicator, that you may be able to use for that purpose. When it comes to high availability, my suggestion is plan for node failures. The cloud is reliable, but not as reliable as having your data center and your people there. In fact, it may be cheaper because you don't have to hire data center staff, but that also means you probably need to replicate your nodes. So you want to keep the cost down, you have replicated nodes. Node provisioning is not necessarily quick. The idea of I can have an instance instantly to auto-scale is a good idea, but realistically it takes maybe even up to 5 to 10 minutes to provision a new host, and also to replicate the data might take longer depending on how large your data is. Make backups. Backups are so important. I know, I heard a snicker, but many people don't make backups and then they cry later. Sometimes you can get bad nodes. Bad nodes means you've got the underlying hardware is bad. Shoot the node in the head, start a new node. Don't get attached to the node. This is not hardware you purchased with cold hard cash. You can just kill the instance and start something else. Some very quick closing thoughts. Hardware varies tremendously per region. The newer regions will have better hardware. So if you take Amazon, for example, you may get some really old hardware, but when you use Amazon in Dublin, you'll probably get some really new hardware. And probably the newest hardware would exist in, say, Sao Paulo. Software manageability can also vary per region. Many of these companies backing OpenStack, for example, turn out that OpenStack is also rapidly developing and you have a release once every 6 months. Some of them have different API versions, and different regions will have different versions available to you. So HP is a prime example of this, in where one region has more modern software than the other. So this is not really ready for your use, especially if you depend on it. And beware costs on your credit card. If you have an American Express with no limit, you can get really surprised at the end of the month. And since you're relying on credit cards, remember that it's good to have backups. Google and Amazon are the only 2 services out there that allow you to put a second credit card as a backup. Everyone else doesn't. So the moment they cannot charge your credit card, what happens is they shut your services down. So if you're running a cloud-based, cloud-backed solution and you don't have a backup credit card, you could suddenly find yourself off the internet because you forgot to pay a bill maybe. So these are some things you really need to think about with regards to MySQL on the cloud. Now, this talk is actually generally supposed to be much longer, but I have resources on my blog about them. So if you have any questions, you can obviously ask them maybe later or via my email address. And the slides will be online. Plus, if you want more in-depth notes on this, my blog is a good place to find in-depth notes. Visit Planet MySQL and Planet MariaDB and give MariaDB a try. Thank you for listening.